When World War II ended in 1945, the world entered a new kind of conflict. The United States and the Soviet Union had been allies against Nazi Germany, but their alliance quickly gave way to an ideological struggle that would shape the next half-century. It was not simply a contest between two military superpowers. It was a conflict over competing visions of economics, government, culture, education, colonialism, and the future of humanity. A popular saying claims that history is written by the winners. The phrase is often attributed to Winston Churchill, although its exact origins are uncertain. Nevertheless, the idea raises an important historical question. After a major conflict, who gets to define the meaning of the conflict? Who controls the institutions that educate the next generation? Who determines which political philosophies are considered legitimate and which are treated as dangerous? Those questions became especially important in post-war America. Karl Marx had died decades earlier, but his ideas had acquired an entirely new significance. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had transformed Marxism from an intellectual critique of capitalism into the ideological foundation of a major world power. By 1945, the Soviet Union controlled much of Eastern Europe, and after the communist victory in China in 1949, communism appeared to many Americans to be expanding across the globe. The United States responded with a combination of military alliances, economic programs, intelligence operations, political campaigns, and ideological competition. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild Western Europe, NATO created a military alliance against Soviet expansion, and American policymakers increasingly portrayed liberal capitalism as the economic foundation of political freedom. At home, however, the Cold War produced something more complicated, the Red Scare. Joseph McCarthy became the most famous symbol of this period. McCarthy claimed that communist influence had penetrated the American government and other institutions. Some of the fears surrounding Soviet espionage were not imaginary. Soviet intelligence had genuinely recruited spies and obtained information from within Western governments. But McCarthyism went far beyond documented espionage. Careers were destroyed through accusations, reputations were ruined, and suspicion itself became a political weapon. The result was a profound transformation in American political culture. Communism ceased to be merely a competing economic philosophy. It became associated with disloyalty, subversion, and foreign influence. This distinction matters because Marxism itself was considerably broader than Soviet communism. Marx had developed a critique of capitalism based upon class relations, ownership of productive resources, labor, capital accumulation, and the distribution of economic power. Soviet Marxism-Leninism represented one historical interpretation of those ideas. It was not synonymous with every form of socialism, Marxist theory, or criticism of capitalism. Nevertheless, during the Cold War, those distinctions were frequently blurred. At the same time that Marxist ideas were being attacked politically, competing economic philosophies were gaining influence in the United States. John Maynard Keynes had already transformed economic thinking by arguing that governments could intervene in capitalist economies to reduce unemployment and stabilize economic crises. After the war, Keynesian economics became highly influential within the American establishment. But another intellectual tradition was developing in opposition to socialism, economic planning, and increasingly to Keynesian interventionism. Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises had developed powerful criticisms of central economic planning. Hayek argued that economic knowledge was dispersed throughout society and that no central authority could possess enough information to efficiently coordinate an entire economy. Later, Milton Friedman and the Chicago School developed a particularly influential American defense of competitive markets, monetary stability, and limited government intervention. Bezmenov, a Soviet defector, became famous for describing what he called Soviet ideological subversion. According to his account, weakening an enemy did not necessarily require military conquest. Instead, an adversary could be weakened gradually by influencing education, culture, political institutions, and public attitudes over decades. Bezmenov described a progression from demoralization to destabilization, followed by crisis and normalization. His claims have become enormously popular in contemporary political discussions. But they need to be treated as what they are, the testimony and interpretation of a former Soviet intelligence-related official, not proof that every later social conflict was secretly engineered by Moscow. That distinction is particularly important because the Cold War produced genuine propaganda and covert operations on both sides. The United States conducted psychological warfare and political interventions. The Soviet Union conducted its own propaganda and influence operations. Both superpowers attempted to shape the political consciousness of populations around the world. The battlefield was therefore not only territory. It was the human mind. Africa demonstrated how complicated that battlefield could become. The Soviet Union presented itself as an opponent of Western imperialism, while the United States frequently presented capitalism as the foundation of freedom and economic development. African nations had to navigate between these competing systems while dealing with the legacies of European colonialism. Some governments adopted socialism. Some aligned with the United States. Some attempted non-alignment. Others shifted between the competing powers depending upon circumstances. The Cold War eventually ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yet the ideological conflicts did not disappear. The Soviet Union disappeared. Colonialism did not disappear from historical memory. Economic inequality did not disappear. Foreign corporate influence did not disappear. Resource extraction did not disappear. And the question of whether political independence produces genuine economic independence remained unresolved. This helps explain why a new generation of African political movements has sometimes embraced strongly anti-Western, anti-imperialist or anti-capitalist rhetoric without necessarily embracing traditional Soviet communism. The contemporary situation is particularly visible in parts of the Sahel, where resentment toward France, Western governments, and established political institutions has created opportunities for new geopolitical actors. Russia has attempted to capitalize on this environment, presenting itself as a partner against Western imperialism and expanding military, diplomatic, and economic relationships across parts of Africa. But modern Russian influence should not simply be equated with the old Soviet project. Contemporary Russia is pursuing a combination of nationalism, geopolitical competition, military influence, economic interests, and anti-Western messaging rather than simply exporting Marxist-Leninist revolution. The historical irony is that some of the language now being used against the West, imperialism, exploitation, sovereignty, neocolonialism, has roots in intellectual movements that developed during the original period of decolonization. The Cold War therefore left behind more than nuclear weapons and military alliances. It left behind competing historical memories. For many Americans, the 20th century demonstrated the danger of communism, centralized planning, and ideological authoritarianism. For many people in formerly colonized countries, the same century demonstrated the persistence of Western economic dominance and the necessity of resisting imperialism. Both memories contain elements of historical truth. And both can become distorted when turned into absolute explanations. Perhaps the most useful way to understand the post-war world is therefore not to ask whether the Americans or the Soviets were simply the good guys or the bad guys. Instead, we should ask how competing powers attempted to shape the economic and political systems of an emerging world, and how ordinary nations and intellectuals attempted to use that struggle for their own purposes. The Cold War was not simply a war between Washington and Moscow. It was a global argument over capitalism, socialism, nationalism, colonialism, sovereignty, and human freedom. And although the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, the argument never really ended.
Is this you talking or the